Muchas gracias por esta invitación. Estoy muy contenta de estar aquí, de conocer al equipo de investigación y sobre todo de presentaros este work in progress de alguna manera. ¿Cambio al inglés? Sí. Okay. What I'm trying to do is to present the main lines of Leo Strauss' interpretation of the Republic. And then trying to suggest some problems in his interpretation, but also a way of dealing and taking advantage of the positive insights that Leo Strauss presents on Plato's Republic. So, Leo Strauss presents the main lines of his interpretation of Plato's Republic in a book published in 1961, titled The City and Man. The volume is a collection of 3 essays, the first one on Aristotle's politics, the second one on Plato's Republic, and the third one on Thucydides' War of the Peloponnesian. The central position of the chapter on Plato shows, according to a Straussian principle, the essential role played by the same in the economy of the book. Plato, in fact, is the key for entering Strauss' mature thought. In the last decade of his production, the philosopher devotes himself to what he called the return to classical political philosophy. After spending almost 30 years analyzing the work of some of the most important modern and medieval philosophers like Hobbes, Spinoza, Machiavelli, and Maimonides, Strauss' interest moved towards ancient thinkers. As Strauss himself explains in the meaningful introduction of the volume, it is not, I'm quoting, self-forgetting and pain-loving antiquarianism, nor self-forgetting and intoxicated romanticism, which induces us to turn with passionate interest, with unqualified willingness to learn, toward the political thought of classical antiquity. We are impelled to do so by the crisis of our time, the crisis of the West. It is worth to be recalled that Strauss wrote this line from the University of Chicago during the Cold War. Here, Strauss links his studies of classical philosophy to the necessity of confronting both the theoretical and political crises of present-day world. Following his diagnosis, the theoretical verge of the crisis lies in the involution of modern political philosophy into political science, while the political one refers to the failure in achieving the core of modern political project, that is to say, a universal, prosperous, and peaceful society. So, on one side, the return to classical philosophy is related to the recovery of the conceptual structure of a radical, philosophical interrogation on political problems, while, on the other side, it is expected to suggest an alternative framework for contemporary political life. In Strauss' words, an adequate understanding of the principles as elaborated by the classics may be the indispensable starting point for an adequate analysis to be achieved by us of present-day society in its peculiar character, and for the wise application to be achieved by us of these principles to our task. This means that Strauss' reading of the Republic is not just the result of philological and historical interest, but of a philosophical one. In particular, as we have seen, Strauss' aims is to criticize modernity, means modern philosophy starting from Machiavelli and Hobbes, and its political outcomes. According to Strauss, modern political philosophy lowers the virtuous standard of human action of the ancient and stop wondering about excellence and the best regime, put its craving for justice into universal rationality and the institutional mechanism of the state. In other words, modernity believes in man's equality and human progress, social and political. This way, it creates the dangerous illusion of the actual possibility of the just city. Nowadays, though, for Strauss, it became, I'm quoting, it became clearer than it had been for some time that no bloody or unbloody change of society can eradicate the evil in man. As long as there will be man, there will be malice, envy, and hatred. And hence there cannot be a society which just does not have to employ coercive restraint. And he goes on, for the foreseeable future, political society remains what it always has been, a partial or particular society whose most urgent and primary task is its self-improvement. I will show in a while how these sentences in some ways echoes the conclusion that Strauss draws in The Republic. From this perspective, Strauss' understanding of ancient political thought must be seen as the intellectual antidote to current capitalistic and communistic societies, intended as the dystopic results of the modern principles. In other words, Strauss looked into the classics in order to recover an alternative conception of politics and philosophy. In this sense, I will argue that it's not possible to separate the outcomes of the Straussian reading of Plato from its anti-modern, anti-progressist, and anti-egalitarian statements. These, in fact, explain the ironical meaning he looks for in The Republic. Interpreters belonging to the so-called Straussian school either overlook this factor or implicitly agree with this perspective. On the other side, scholars that disagree with Strauss' political conservative and elitist viewpoint almost always stresses the intrinsic weakness of his method in order to criticize him. Instead, as I said in the last part of my talk, I'd like to suggest that Strauss' reading strategy can be valuable for Platonic scholars, even without an agreement on his conclusions. In order to develop this idea, I will turn now on Strauss' hermeneutic principles. In a sentence I quoted above, Strauss talked about the need for an adequate understanding of the classics. In fact, according to him, the crisis of our time may have the accidental advantage of enabling us to understand in an untraditional or fresh manner what was before understood only in a traditional or derivative manner. In this sentence, we can hear the influence of Strauss' former professor, Martin Heidegger. Here we can find one first insight into Strauss' method. In fact, Heidegger's philosophical readings offer a fresh, a new understanding of the ancients, while dismissing the historical framework of the work. In the words of another prominent student of Heidegger, Hannah Arendt, for Heidegger, it was technically, I'm quoting, decisive that, for instance, Plato was not talked about on his theory or his theory of ideas expounded. Rather, for an entire semester, a single dialogue was parsed and subjected to question step by step, until the time-honored doctrine had disappeared to make room for a set of problems of immediate and urgent relevance. This is exactly the way in which also Strauss proceeds in his analysis. The problem here is that the philosophical questioning of the dialogue occupies almost the entire field of the research, leaving behind all the historical, literary, and philosophical sources that can suggest a different framework or understanding. Strauss takes advantage of the new hermeneutic possibilities opened by Heidegger, developing his own peculiar understanding of classical authors. In fact, unlike Heidegger, he disconnects Plato from the Neoplatonic and Christian tradition, reading his work through the suggestion of Jewish and Arabic medieval philosophers. So, he presents a very original perspective on Plato's philosophy. Nevertheless, he commits to the history of philosophy in a peculiar way. In fact, he refuses the historicist perspective and he tries to understand the classic as they would have understood themselves. But in doing so, he exposes himself to the major fall, in my opinion, in his strategy. This idea of understood the ancient author as they have understood themselves, as they would have understood themselves, in fact presupposes the possibility to grasp the author's intentions, something that is especially risky if we are talking about ancient text. Not just because we are well aware of the philological issues related to the transmission of these sources, but also because the conception of the almighty author that this idea implies doesn't fit what we know of ancient manuscripts and their composition. The debate is still open both on the collective and long-term composition of the Platonic dialogues. But if it's true that research must take risk, otherwise it's irrelevant, let's take a closer look to Strauss' hermeneutics. To enter the detail of Strauss' controversial hermeneutical approach, we have to turn towards his most famous book, Persecution and the Art of Writing, published in 1941. Here Strauss develops his research on medieval Arab and Jewish thinkers such as Maimonides and Farabi. Strauss states at the beginning of his book that he wants to investigate the relations between philosophy and society, rediscovering a phenomenon to which our time is blind, but of which philosophers from the past were well aware, the phenomenon of political persecution. According to Strauss, to understand the history of philosophy, it is necessary to develop a sociology of philosophy, meaning a specific attention to the need for the philosopher to hide his true thoughts. Now, the manner in which the philosopher is able to hide his thoughts in plain sight is by developing a distinction between esoteric and exoteric teaching. The thesis that Strauss presents is linear and intelligible enough. Since political power is able to persecute philosophers in many ways, philosophers must protect themselves. The way in which philosophers protect themselves from political power is by elaborating a code, a specific language, and an art of writing, in which the truth is presented exclusively between the lines. That literature, and now I quote Strauss, is addressed not to all readers, but to trustworthy readers only. It has all the advantages of private communication without having its greatest disadvantage, that it reaches only the writer's acquaintances. It has all the advantages of public communication without having its greatest disadvantage, the capital punishment for the author. To this twofold art of writing corresponds an art of reading between the lines. In fact, only thoughtful men who are careful readers can reach the deepest esoteric meaning of the text. Strauss suggests some criteria in order to do so. And he says, and he writes, if a master of the art of writing commits such blunders as would shame an intelligent high school boy, it is reasonable to assume that they are intentional, especially if the author discusses, however incidentally, the possibility of an intentional blunders in writing. The views of the author of a drama or dialogue must not, without previous proof, be identified with the views expressed by one or more of his characters, or with those agreed upon by all his characters, or by his attractive characters. The real opinion of an author is not necessarily identical with that which he expresses in the largest number of passages. In short, exactness is not to be confused with refusal or inability to see the wood for the trees. The truly exact historian will reconcile himself to the fact that there is a difference between winning an argument or proving to practically everyone that he is right and understanding the thoughts of the great writers of the past. Strauss is well aware of the fact that, as Ginsburg put it, scholarship is, among other things, a more or less successful attempt to recover a knowledge which is inscribed between the lines, written in invisible ink on the fragmentary evidence of the past. But also, we can understand why for scholars it has been so easy to reject Strauss' method as a tautological one. To put it in terms of Kojève, Strauss' art of reading would be like the method of a detective, with the only difference that it cannot lead up to the confession of the criminal. It can work only if we accept its own assumptions. In spite of this objection, I'd like to appreciate Strauss' invitation to consider more carefully the sources we are reading, trying to recover in them an untraditional meaning. When it comes to Platonic dialogues, this means also to read them as dramatic text, where every detail of the scene matters, something that nowadays is accepted by a growing group of scholars. Strauss' arguments in the Republic is the following. Socrates is the first example of a philosopher persecuted by power, and in response to this, Plato elaborates his own art of writing, based on the logographic necessity. Following Farabi on Plato, Strauss claims that at that time, in Athens, philosophy and philosopher were in grave danger. Society did not recognize philosophy or the right to philosophizing. I'm quoting Strauss. There was no harmony between philosophy and society. The philosophers were very far from being exponents of societies or parties. They defended the interests of philosophy and nothing else. In doing this, they believed indeed that they were defending the highest interests of mankind. The exoteric teaching was needed to protect philosophy. It was the armor in which philosophy had to appear. It was needed for philosophical reasons. It was the form in which philosophy became visible to political community. It was the political aspect of philosophy. It was political philosophy. So Strauss is not only recovering the way in which we should read Plato, he is also pointing out the original essence of political philosophy. Political philosophy is the manner in which philosophy presents itself to the political community. But since it is impossible to separate the form from the content, the way in which philosophy appears also reveals the substance of its teaching. Philosophy may be persecuted by political power because its search for truth amounts to the questioning of the opinions that the political community, the city, in Strauss' terms, needs to believe in to constitute and preserve its identity. Political order can be maintained only if the minority of the philosophers doesn't openly criticize the beliefs, superstitions, and faiths that constitute the identity of a political community. In this sense, and quoting Strauss, the distinction between exoteric and esoteric speech has then so little to do with mysticism of any sort that it is an outcome of prudence. It is clear so far why esotericism is a political necessity. But according to Strauss, there is also a close connection between esotericism and a peculiar attitude towards political life. Strauss claimed that esotericism owes its existence to the necessary imperfection of politics itself. In fact, what political philosophy reveals in its Platonic form is the awareness that every political constitution, even the best one, is necessarily imperfect. I quote Strauss, "The concealed reason for the imperfection of political life, as such, are the facts that all political life is essentially inferior to contemplative life, and that the requirements of the lower are bound from time to time to conflict with and to supersede in practice the requirements of the higher." This statement on the hierarchy between philosophical life and politics is at the core of Strauss' conception of Plato's political philosophy. It is also what determines the superiority of classical political philosophy over modern political philosophy. Classical political philosopher knew, according to Strauss, that contemplative life is essentially superior to political life, that political practices cannot attain the perfection of philosophical life, and they assume this knowledge as central in their political thought. So, the point is, for Strauss, that we should read Plato's work having in mind the problem of persecution. This means that we have to look for a deeper meaning of the Republic, beside the theories that the work expresses through a careful reading of it. However, we have also to consider that Plato was just not aware of the necessity of binding his true teaching, but also of the essential tension between politics and philosophy. For this reason, he cannot believe, like the modern, in the actual realization of the just city. This because, according to Strauss, the philosophers were very far from being exponents, as we have said, of societies or parties. They defended the interest of philosophy and nothing else. My point is that this view, of course, is quite reductive of the complexity of the actual historical situation. And in fact, I will argue that Plato's political ambition were just redirected and not cancelled by the philosophical conversion. If we turn now to Strauss' reading of the Republic, having in mind this problem, we can understand why Strauss affirms that reading Plato, one cannot separate the understanding of the teaching from the understanding of the form in which it is presented. I'm quoting from the essay on Plato's Republic in The City and Man. One must pay as much attention to the how as to the what. At any rate, to begin with, one must even pay greater attention to the form than to the substance, since the meaning of the substance depends on the form. Emphasizing this aspect, Strauss points out the way in which we should read the dialogues. To begin with, we cannot read them as if they were a philosophical dogmatic treatise. Instead, we must read them as dramatic text. Next, we have to consider the dialogical form as a literary genre. Strauss' idea is that in Platonic dialogues, every detail is meaningful and holds significance for the meaning of the whole. The choice of the title, of the characters, the unfolding of the plot, all these elements contribute to defining the general meaning of the dialogue itself. The dialogic form aims to imitate the flexibility of oral communication, but it is also a remedy for the defects of the medium of writing itself. I quote Strauss, "What it means to read a good writing properly is intimated by Socrates in the Phaedrus, when he describes the character of a good writing. A writing is good if it complies with logographic necessity, with the necessity which ought to govern the writing of speeches. Every part of the written speech must be necessary for the whole. The place where each part occurs is the place where it is necessary that it should occur. In a word, the good writing must resemble the healthy animal which can do its proper work well." According to this perspective, the Platonic dialogues say different things to different people, not accidentally, as all writings do, but that is so contrived as to say different things to different people, or that it is radically ironical. So irony assumes a central role in the interpretation of the text. Since it is impossible for Strauss to separate the form from the content, irony is the key to understanding the dialogue's philosophical meaning. Since Socrates is the spokesman par excellence for Plato, we have to consider what might be the meaning of speaking through the mouth of a man who is notorious for his irony. According to Strauss, irony is a kind of dissimulation or of untruthfulness. The noble dissimulation of one's worth, of one's superiority. Intended in this way, irony is the form in which a man who is aware of his own superiority addresses an inherently divided audience. It is not a vice, but a form of humanity, the humanity peculiar to the superior man. Said Strauss, he spares the feelings of his inferiors by not displaying his superiority. It follows that irony cannot be understood merely as a rhetorical pleasantry, but instead as to be understood as a political necessity. I quote Strauss, essentially related to the fact that there is a natural rank among men. That is to say, to the question of esotericism. So, the Republic should express, ironically, Plato's authentic political teaching. This means that we have to read the dialogue paying attention to every detail, not just the speeches, but also the action, not just the words, but also the silences. And at the end, we cannot take seriously the thesis pronounced by Socrates. The consequence is that the political content of the Republic must not be intended as a rational political project, but instead as a cure for political ambition. Strauss writes, "The Republic conveys the broadest and deepest analysis of political idealism ever made." In other words, through the paradoxical expression of Socrates, Plato is showing the impossibility of the ideal regime is describing. Strauss says, Socrates makes clear in the Republic of what character the city would have to be in order to satisfy the highest need of man. By letting us see that the city constructed in accordance with these requirements is not possible, he let us see the essential limits, the nature of the city. This is the conclusion that we found at the beginning of Strauss' commentary. The argument can be resumed this way. We cannot believe Socrates because the measures he suggests are clearly ironical. On one hand, in fact, the communism of women and goods is against nature, and on the other hand, we cannot find in the dialogue a plain explanation of how would be possible the rule of the philosophers. So, on one side, Plato cannot seriously propose reforms that made abstraction of the body and the eros, pointing out that the perfect city can exist just in speech. And on the other side, he offers no solution to the problem of the tension between the philosophers and the city. We cannot understand why the philosophers should renounce to the privilege of a philosophical life, neither we can understand why the city should accept them as their rulers. This aporia, according to Strauss' esoteric reading, points out Plato's real intentions. Well, I'm going to conclude with the last part. So it is easy enough to observe how Strauss pushes deliberately away all that elements and arguments in favor of a realistic reading of the Republic. It would be enough to mention just a few of them. First of all, the state described in the Republic is presented in different occasions as possible, difficult, of course, but possible. Particularly in 4 passages of the dialogue, Plato mentioned the necessary condition for the realization of the best regime in Book 5, 6, 7, and 9. If we look just at the passages in Book 5, there is Socrates talking about the communism of the guardians, and he qualifies the city as the paradigm of a good polis. Paradigma agates poleos. This refers to a theoretical description that is intended to be realized in praxis. A project that, like every project, presupposes certain difference within its application, but not in its substance. Second, the starting point of the Republic is exactly the problem of the just city, and Plato's diagnosis point out the problem of power and pleonexia as the origin of the stasis. From this point of view, we can understand why Plato's cure, as this is presented in the dialogue, stresses the necessity of eradicate all the attachments that link the ruling class to its private interests, especially if we consider that in the same period other thinkers, as Antiphon or Hippias, were arguing against the most consolidated structures of marriage and family, while communistic ideas were circulating into the inner Socratic circle. The sophisticated reflection Plato dedicated to the relation between the private and the common sphere seems instead, as some recent scholars have pointed out, one of the most innovative and interesting aspects of Plato's thought, even if it contradicts contemporary common sense. Another aspect that plays against Strauss' ironical reading, as Vegetti points out, is the long and solid tradition that affirms just the opposite. Starting from Aristotle, so the interpreters until recent times have taken seriously Plato's proposal. While using the Aristotelian criticism against the Callipolis, Strauss forgets to mention this detail. Moreover, he also forgets about the testimony of the seventh letter that points out exactly the coincidence between philosophy and power as the main core of Plato's enterprise. Politics lies beyond Plato's interest for philosophy. According to the letter, Plato was actually trying to execute in Syracuse the ideas he elaborated in the Republic, and he possibly was also influenced by the experiments of the philosophical rule in Taranto. He certainly was aware also of the Pythagorean theories and communities, experimenting the koinaton ton philon way of life. Nevertheless, Strauss' suggestion about the phenomenon of persecution still stands as an intriguing hypothesis if we look at the historical data, even if we don't agree with the ironical outcome of the Republic. Irony, in fact, points out the controversial character of Plato's reforms. The Politeia seems the attempt to find a cure for the sickness of the city in the context of a civil war that was also a war against philosophy. But the cure that Republic proposes is exactly based on that political ambition that Plato cultivated as a natural member of the Athenian ruling class. It is worth to remind that the same Critias wrote a Politeia that could have inspired the dialogue. So if we want to take seriously the problem of persecution, we should imagine Plato coming back from a long exile, wondering about the possibility of reforming his city, and using the weapon of irony against comedy and the defenders of the democratic regime. So, even taking into account the issue of persecution and the correlated necessity to read the dialogue as a dramatic text, we can still defend the actual meaning of the Republic. There are just some ideas, of course, that I have so briefly sketched that I would like to discuss with you. And in conclusion, I will just argue that Strauss' reading of the Republic seems to overlook too easy these historical aspects, while looking himself for a cure for the illness of contemporary times. Strauss fails in a careful consideration of other sources. This would help us to reconstruct a broader intellectual and political framework where, because of persecution, the radical, revolutionary transformation of the current condition and situation must have seemed to Plato more urgent than ever. Thank you very much for your attention.